Good afternoon and welcome to our coolest science stories on MOS Live. My name is Becca, my pronouns are she and her, and today you are all here to learn about some of the coolest science stories that are out there. Now, if you're joining us on Zoom and you'd like to see captions, you can click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen and click show subtitles. If you're also joining us on Zoom and would like to ask questions at any point during the entire presentation, you can feel free to type those into the Q&A box and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. And if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube, thank you very much for being here, but please note that we are unable to see your questions or comments at this time. Now, today we're going to be talking about 3 different awesome stories. I'm going to be starting us off talking about a story about dinosaurs and how we weigh them. Then I'm going to end off talking about a story about Venus and volcanic activity. But I am joined by one other wonderful educator, so I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and share their story.
Thanks, Becca. Hi, my name is Meg. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm going to share a story today about how and why your brain responds to faces.
Awesome. I'm really excited to hear that, Meg. Thank you for joining me today. Now, we're going to dive into the very first story. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. And as I said, we're going to be talking about dinosaurs, one of my very favorite things. But more specifically, we're going to be talking about dinosaur weight, because that's something that we kind of all think about, but don't really know how we get there. So when we think about dinosaurs, we often think about extremely large animals, and that is incredibly true. Many of them were very large. In fact, here we see an image of a sauropod, one of the long-necked 4-legged dinosaurs that was incredibly large. Now, we've learned a lot about dinosaurs and also about sauropods. We are able to tell how long they are based on the fossils we found, and we can put them back together. We're able to tell how tall they are, but how much they weigh, well, that's been a little bit of a trickier thing. Now, scientists have developed a few ways to weigh dinosaurs. And when it comes to sauropods, there happen to be about 20 species that make up that group of long-necked sauropod dinosaurs. And so all of them, when you take them into consideration, sauropods are known to weigh somewhere from 20 to 80 tons. That is a lot of weight. In fact, if you think of an elephant, which weighs approximately 2 to 7 tons, well, if you were thinking of a sauropod, an elephant weight, you would need anywhere from 4 elephants to 16 elephants. That's incredibly heavy. Now, if we can think of sort of that range for a large group of animals, how can we think about one specific species of dinosaurs? And that's where it gets a little bit more tricky. First, we need to dive into how dinosaurs get weighed. One of the ways that scientists do it is that they look at an animal that exists right now. For example, this is a cassowary, it's a bird, and I thought that was fitting because birds are technically dinosaurs. So this one is just one that lives now compared to what we used to have. So scientists take a specific bone or maybe a few different bones in a current bird or other animal. They take the circumference, so the width around it. They also might take some of the weight of that, and then they'll scale all of that up to be as large as the fossils that they found in order to kind of determine a weight overall for the dinosaur. Now, this is actually pretty accurate because it's able to give you a really good accurate number, but it might not be that precise because this doesn't necessarily look like the dinosaurs that we're thinking of. So the bones may be a little bit different. So while it's accurate, it's not super precise. On the other hand, the other way that scientists are able to weigh dinosaurs is to create kind of 3D visualization models of dinosaurs. And then they're able to take the volume of these 3D models and again, kind of use that volume to scale it up to a larger size. And this is much more precise. You're able to get a pretty precise reading for exactly how much that would weigh, but it may not be that accurate because it's up to each subjective scientist to kind of figure out what this dinosaur looked like when you're creating the 3D model. So we may not actually know if that's actually correct. So we have one way that is accurate but not precise, and the other way that is more precise but not as accurate. Well, what's best? Well, a study published on just Monday from the Royal Ontario Museum looked at both of these different types of weighing dinosaurs, and they determined that both of them can work together to give us the best possible explanation, the best possible chance at getting the correct weight. And in fact, we've been able to learn a little bit more over time, and our ways of measuring have gotten even better, because by combining both of these, you're going to get a very accurate measurement. Scientists found that the way by calculating by bone scaling, just like this, and also the way by calculating from 3D models, just like this, get you pretty much the same answer. So by combining them as two different ways for the same dinosaur, you get a pretty accurate weight overall. And that's how we've learned a lot about dinosaurs. So again, if we were to take this and apply it to one specific type of dinosaur, say the T-Rex, as we can see here, there are a few different models of T-Rexes. These were actually models that are from real fossilized T-Rexes that have been found, including Dinosaur Sue, one of the most popular ones, which is the red T-Rex, the really large one here. And so by applying both of these models, scientists found that T-Rexes were probably about 7 tons. Only there's going to be a margin of error because we can never fully accurately weigh a dinosaur because they're not here right now. So instead, scientists say more that it's probably 5 to 10 tons. And that is a really good margin of error to really understand kind of what that animal weighed like. So scientists are going to be able to do this for a lot of dinosaurs. And the more technology we get and the better at this we get, the better and more accurate our weights are going to be. Now, why is this important? Well, because, first, the T-Rex was about 1.5 elephants. Forgot to say that. This is important because weight tells us a lot about the dinosaur. By knowing how much a dinosaur weighs, we'll know how it moves, how easily it moves, how far it can move. We also will know what it eats. We'll be able to figure out how much it needs to eat in order to survive and hopefully learn more about the lifestyle of dinosaurs overall. So weighing in on dinosaurs is definitely something that is developing, but it's exciting to know that we are on the right track. And hopefully we'll be able to learn more about our past dinosaur relatives, well, in a relative term, in the future. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Meg, who's going to share a little bit about her story.
Thanks, Becca. That is so cool that those two methods matched. So I'm just going to remind everyone that if you have any questions and you're joining us on Zoom, you can type them into the Q&A box, and we're going to answer as many of those about these 3 stories as we can at the end. Now, faces carry a lot of information. Just with a look, you might be able to tell whether someone is happy or stressed or friendly or maybe not so much. And it's maybe no surprise then that our brains are set up to prioritize processing information about faces. In fact, we've known for the last couple of decades that there's a special area of the brain called the fusiform face area, or the FFA, which you can see here in the spinning brain in red, that seems to be specifically involved in perceiving human faces. But did we develop this face-specific region of the brain in response to seeing lots of other human faces over our lifetime? Or is this nature rather than nurture, and somehow it's built in? This is part of a fundamental debate that goes way back about why the brain is structured the way it is, and a new study from MIT has some information to add. The researchers found that the face-specific area of your brain responds to faces even if you've never seen one before. Here's what they did. They asked for volunteers who are congenitally blind, that is blind from birth, as well as several sighted people. And they asked each of them to explore by touch a series of 3D printed objects, a chair, a face, a maze, and a hand. And at the same time, they put them in an MRI machine to image their brains. You can see this big wheel of 3D printed objects here. So they had 4 of each kind of object around the outside of the wheel, and then they would just rotate it so that each person was in the MRI, they could touch each one at a time. So MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging, and this machine uses magnetic fields and radio waves to non-invasively image the structure of soft tissues inside the body, like the brain. This study used a technique called functional MRI, or fMRI, to capture activity in different parts of the brain in response to different stimuli, like touching the 3D printed objects. This technique works because extra brain activity requires extra blood flow. It uses energy just like anything else you exercise. And all that extra blood flow changes the proportion of oxygen carrying blood compared to deoxygenated blood in the part of the brain that's working extra hard. That tiny difference can be detected in the MRI machine. So, by comparing brain images taken when each person touched the chair, for example, to when they touched the face, the researchers could tell if the FFA lit up specifically in response to the faces. And that is what happened. To make sure they were really seeing this effect, they ran the experiment 3 times. First, they asked the sighted people to do the brain scan while looking at the objects, and as expected, the fusiform face area lit up. I've circled it in aqua over there. And then they asked the same sighted participants to do the scan again, but this time to explore the objects by touch only, that is, haptically. The FFA lit up again this time, but not as brightly as the first time. And finally, they asked the blind volunteers to do the brain scan while haptically exploring the 3D printed objects. And this time the FFA lit up, even though these people had never seen a face before. This is an interesting result because it helps us weed out some hypotheses that don't fit with this data. So one theory about the face-specific region is that it develops directly in response to visual information coming from the center of the visual field, or foveal vision, as opposed to peripheral vision. Since we normally shift our gaze to center other human faces, the idea would be that maybe this part of the brain is triggered just because triggered by faces in particular, just because we happen to put them in the middle of our view. But this new study contradicts that because no visual input was needed at all for the brains of the congenitally blind volunteers to light up. So the researchers then wondered whether the area might just be sensitive to curved objects over rectangular ones and maybe not specific to faces. So to test that, they asked the blind participants to handle a few other 3D printed shapes like cube spheres and eggs. And the FFA didn't respond to the curved shapes any more than to the rectangular ones. So it does seem to have something to do with faces in particular. To test this even further, they repeated an experiment from a previous study, and they played different sounds for the blind participants, some related to faces, like laughing or chewing, and others related to bodies, objects, and scenes, like clapping, a ball bouncing, or waves crashing. And this time, the FFA did respond specifically to the face-related sounds. But why does this happen? By looking at how the different brain regions respond together or don't, the team analyzed the connectivity fingerprints of both the sighted and the blind participants. And they found significant similarities, suggesting that some basic wiring of the brain happens early in development that determines where this responsiveness to faces takes place. So that's a step toward the nature side of the debate over nurture, at least for this specific aspect of brain function. And it just goes to show you how important other human faces are, even if you've never seen one. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Becca. And I believe we are traveling to space.
We are. We're going to be going to Venus. And so Venus is the second planet from the sun, one closer than Earth is, and it is definitely about Earth size. It is a little bit smaller, but ever so slightly. It is approximately the same size, but it is very, very different from Earth. In fact, Venus is covered with extremely thick clouds and a very thick atmosphere made up of gases that we know on Earth not to support life, but who knows? Now, Venus is a little bit difficult to see because of its thick atmosphere. So luckily, scientists were able to develop tools, including orbiters, to actually map out the surface. So in 1989, Magellan, as we can see here launching from the space shuttle Atlantis, went into orbit around Venus, where it stayed from 1990 to 1994. And during those 4 years, it was able to map a lot of the surface. In fact, over 85% of the surface. And it was able to send radar imaging back to Earth, where we could compile the data and get a pretty good map of the surface of Venus. And from there, it was able to see a lot of different structures and features that we maybe didn't even know had existed. One of those interesting features is that Magellan saw what looked to be volcanoes and a lot of lava flows. Now, that, as cool as that is, confused scientists a little bit because Venus is not quite like Earth, where we have erosion, meaning that wind and water kind of destroy our rocks over time, so they don't necessarily stay on the surface for that long in their regular shape. That doesn't really happen on Venus. So these rocks could have stayed exactly as they are for millions of years. So even though we saw volcanoes on Venus and we saw lava flows, in fact, 85% of the surface was covered in them, was it really geologically active then? And is it geologically active now? That was the biggest question for a really long time. But luckily, earlier this year, we got a little bit of a hint. You see, here on Earth, in order to have volcanic activity, we have a geologically active planet. We have a planet where there's heat that is moving in the center. We have different layers, and we often have volcanoes, which is that source of heat kind of coming out. In fact, magma comes up from the mantle pretty often in a few different ways. One of those ways might be that it comes up in a plume straight from the mantle, just straight through the crust, up to the surface, and comes up with some volcanoes, like the Hawaiian Islands are created in this way. There's other ways where perhaps the magma comes up where two different plates on the Earth are spreading apart, either continental or oceanic plates. And there's also places where plates might come together and one kind of goes underneath the other, it gets dragged down. And as it gets dragged down, some of the fluid and causes from the friction there melts, and it causes some of that magma to come up and create volcanoes, much like the Ring of Fire. But that means that we're geologically active on Earth. But that also means that in order for the volcanoes to pop up on Venus, there has to be some sort of activity. But it's not happening now. Well, like I said, this was something that scientists looked into very early on, a few months ago now, and they were looking specifically at the corona or the coronae around the volcanoes, which is basically this sort of set of rings that you would see around the volcano in the center. And they were able to look at radar imaging from Magellan and other telescopes and also create computer models to determine which ones were active. Now, they categorize active as being able to see this outer rise of the corona and also this trench just on the inside. Whereas if you didn't see the outer rise or the trench and only saw the rim and the inner hide, that would be considered inactive. That means that it probably erupted a long time ago and is not currently erupting or recently erupted. And if you could see none of those, well, then it didn't really count as potentially even being a volcano. But scientists were able to use this same data source and the same idea of looking at the corona in order to look at the different volcanoes on Venus. And they determined that 37 of the ones that they looked at were active or are active, meaning that they erupted recently in geological time or they're currently active right now, which is really exciting to think about. And it's also interesting to note that a lot of that activity was happening in certain bands or certain areas of Venus. So maybe some areas are more active than others. Again, this is going to be something that scientists will have to send something to the surface in order to determine a little bit more about the current level of activity. But this is promising that Venus probably could be geologically active even right now, meaning that we here on Earth may not be the only geologically active planet in our solar system after all. So with a little bit more research and a little bit more time, we're going to understand kind of exactly what happens, and maybe we'll see if Venus really is geologically active in the future. So with that, it is now time for us to answer any questions. So I'm going to bring Meg back on and we can start getting some questions answered. Now, for our audience, again, if you would like to type in any questions on Zoom, you're more than welcome to do so about any of our 3 stories, which, for a reminder, were about dinosaur weight, also about face recognition, and also about face recognition and brain waves, and also finally about Venus and volcanic activity. So I have a question for you, Meg. Now you said that this was the fMRI. I'm wondering what's the difference between those different types of MRIs? Because I know some people get MRIs for broken bones or some other things like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So they both use the same general technique, but so a general MRI is looking at different structures in the body. And it does that by picking up little tiny differences in all of the hydrogen atoms that are sprinkled all throughout your body. So a general MRI image is actually showing you which tissues have different amounts of water in them. And that's why there are all these different shades of gray when you look at an MRI image. There are certain tissues that just happen to have more than others, and the MRI is able to distinguish those. So fMRI is a little different because it's not actually hydrogen atoms that they're picking up. It's this difference in blood that's carrying oxygen versus blood that is not carrying oxygen. But they both work on exactly the same principles. You're picking up on these tiny little differences that are related to the magnetic properties of those molecules. And in functional MRI, what you're doing is doing lots of scans of a brain, for example, comparing the images to each other. So you want to know what is the difference between what a brain looks like when somebody is looking at a face versus when somebody is just resting or looking at anything else. And then that tells you something about which parts of the brain are working extra hard when you're looking at that face. Yeah. So
So
I actually
cool.
have a question. Let me see, from my hero here. How would you describe the case of Venus's volcanoes, which just came up recently?
Yeah, that's a great question. And sort of describing timescales is a little bit difficult because for geologic time, we often consider recent as being in the past several million years. So it's one of those things that is a little bit difficult to describe exactly. That's why scientists are saying active, as in potentially active, like we have here on Earth. We don't have every single volcano erupting right now, but some of them could be active, or we could describe them as currently erupting. So in the case of Venus's volcanoes, recently could be anywhere in the past million plus years, or right now, anywhere in between. And that's one of the things that scientists would need to probably send a lander or a rover to Venus in order to understand. But it's not that easy because the atmosphere is pretty difficult to get through and survive underneath. But yeah, that was a great question as well. Let's see. We have a few more questions about Venus and dinosaurs. But I have another question for you, Meg. I'm wondering, so this was sort of recognizing faces and the idea of like facial expressions and stuff, but why do scientists think that maybe we have some sort of draw to faces and things that faces make more than really, I mean, clapping or anything like that?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think that's kind of an open question still. People, we don't have areas of the brain that are specific for every single kind of object. We don't have an area of the brain that only lights up when we see cars or houses or, clouds or anything like that. But there are certain things that do seem to have certain specific areas. Faces is one of them. Also bodies separately. Also, I think there's things, areas related to motion and areas related to colors that respond a little more than the other parts of the brain. So it's really interesting to know that there are some things that seem to be wired in. And I think that does tell us something about how humans evolved and what was important to us evolutionarily in some way. But that is really a major topic of research. Like, why is it that way? And to what extent can it be influenced by experience? Because there still is some balance between nature and nurture here. So that's a great question. And I think that there's going to be a lot of really exciting answers that come from that as people keep studying the brain. So there are lots of like really great questions here about Venus and dinosaurs. So I'm going to keep going and ask a question from Natalie here. Did dinosaurs have feathers?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And scientists are now believing that yes, many of them did have feathers. In fact, we do have a lot of evidence of fossilized feathers or areas where feathers would attach on the skin. So we do know that quite a few of them had feathers, and we kind of infer that even more of them probably had feathers, especially the ones that were the theropods, the ones that walked around on two legs, like the T-Rex, another dinosaur that we think probably had feathers. But as you get sort of further in evolutionary history, birds have feathers, and birds came from dinosaurs, specifically dinosaurs that survived the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period. So chances are, if birds had feathers now, the dinosaurs probably had feathers as soon as that extinction period happened, and they were able to then carry on evolutionarily until now. So yes, dinosaurs did have feathers. Potentially not every single dinosaur, but the more we're finding out, the more we're thinking that quite a few of them did in fact have feathers. So excellent question there. And then let's see, we have time for probably maybe two more questions. So we have another one for Meg here about, oh, this is cool. They're kind of like two different questions. So I'm going to kind of group them together. One about how the brain reacts to different faces of humans, but also maybe how would they react differently to animals? And maybe even I'm wondering, animal faces, is that different than human faces? It's interesting.
That's a great question. I'm not 100% sure the answer to that, but there's a lot of crossover, for example, in studying the brain, the human brain and our reaction to faces, and studying computer vision and trying to get computers to see the way that we do. And I know that in computer vision, faces that are belong to humans or belong to animals are often end up being not exactly in the same category, but they do end up triggering similar responses. There's something about having two eyes and a nose and a mouth that can sort of have some overlap in those two different categories. And I believe that's the same in our own brains. And then as far as different expressions, so one of the things that's neat about this study is that it shows that there's this wiring in the brain that's really fundamental about lighting up in response to faces, and what that means is that it's that area of the brain is linked to higher order processing within the brain, so that we the idea is that if it's linked to this higher order processing, that means that social interactions and interpreting the expressions of people and all of these faces, those are all really intimately connected, and perhaps we're really wired from the ground up in order to process that kind of information quickly, which I could imagine, and I'm speculating, would be very important just from an evolution standpoint, to be able to tell who around you is going to help you or not help you in a situation. So that's one interesting connection that the study may have to future research as well. All right, I think we are probably out of time. So I'm going to say my goodbyes. Thank you everyone for all of your wonderful questions.
Awesome.
Take
Thank
care.
you so much, Meg, for joining me today. So unfortunately, we did not get to answer all of the questions. I apologize. I wish we had just a little bit more time to answer all of them, but thank you for submitting such excellent questions today. And if you're interested in seeing more of these programs, check out www.mos.org/mos@home. And we have a whole bunch of different programs happening in the next few weeks. And if you enjoyed this program and would like to support the museum and science engagement, you can head to engage.mos.org/welcome. Once again, I want to thank you all very much for being here today, and we'll see you next time.